Good evening, everyone. I hope that you are all well and can all hear me. Can somebody thumbs up or do something appropriate so I know that? Thank you, Mike. Excellent. Right. Let me think. I've not prepared this as well as I would have liked. Why? Because I found a really interesting piece. I think it was in the Christadelphian, and it was how you do a character study. How was the individual called? To what were they required to dedicate themselves? How did they or he show their dedication? What was the effect upon themselves and upon those who heard them or him? And finally, most importantly, what warnings and encouragement can we find in their example? So, to what was he a witness? What was the special message of this particular character? How was their message received? What was God's judgment in the case? And what can we learn today? I'll tell you what you can learn today. I put this somewhere in the land of emails and all the rest and couldn't find it. So I've not used it at all. Be afraid. Okay. So, character study on Daniel. What's a character study about? Character can be defined as a collection of sort of personality traits within our behavior that shows who we are. This is seen in our integrity, attitudes, moral fiber, disposition, how we treat those around us. Although this is true, character has got to go much deeper than that. Character is about who we are and our relationship with Jesus. It is something that can be built and learned as we follow him. Genuine Christian character is not about our personality or disposition. It is a description of who we are as Christians and what we are called to be in our entirety. And I want you to hold on to that word, entirety, because in a sense, the whole 9 yards, from beginning to end. In a sense, that is what we see in the character Daniel. And that's one of the things that's sort of stood out for me. It's a lovely little ditty that said, talent is a gift, character is a choice. And it is especially, it's not just a soundbite, I think it's especially pertinent to the character of Daniel. And I should thank the Bible class committee for giving me this character because I've not really looked at him. I know I've never really sort of looked at Daniel. I think I've looked at him sort of in passing, and it's sort of like the Lion's Den and the likes. Our character and faith can grow as they are applied in our daily lives. And this is what we see in this character. And we have a chance to get some depth, re this character, our brother Daniel, as it were. And I'm going to go through the chapters, as it were, from 1 through to 12. The nice bit is it's not so much a study on Daniel and prophecies and the likes, for which I'm exceptionally grateful. But one of the things that stands out is that actually 1 to 12 is not synchronized in time. It kind of goes backwards and forwards a little bit. So Daniel chapter 1. He began in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles, etc. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So he was taken to Babylon during the first wave of captives in around 602 BC. I think one of the really helpful things in the book is that you have it specifying who was king and sort of at what time, and that helps to date and give some context as well to our character. So he was a youth when he was taken, but lived and witnessed in Babylon until he was I don't want to say an old man, but actually until he was an old man. And I think that's something we need to hold on to because it's kind of reassuring. He served as an official through the reigns of successive Babylonian kings, Nebuchadnezzar, 604 to 562. That might be to show the second slide. Yeah. 604 to 562 BC. Evil Merodach, 561 to 560 BC. Neriglissar, 559 to 555. Nabonius, 555 to 539. Then Daniel served under several Persian and Mede kings. Cyrus, 539 to 529. Cambyses, 529 to 522. And Darius, 522 to 436. I just want you to kind of picture that in your mind, in a sense. I'm not that sort of biblical and academic in terms of remembering all of those, but what I want you to hold on to is the kings in the time of Daniel, and it is 70 years plus that Daniel served. Okay, I want you to hold on to that. And I think various kind of accounts give us sort of wavering sort of dates, but he was there from the beginning of the captivity right to the end, and then some. And in terms of looking at some of the timelines, you'd see that Daniel might have been around sort of 80 to 90. He didn't talk about being 100, but around 100 years of age to the end, as it were, of his ministry. But on my magic sheet of paper, it says, don't hold me to the numbers, please don't. The incident of the lion's den, I always have an idea that it's a sprightly Daniel, and I've had to stop and have a think. And when we look at his time, it is long, it is about successful witness under servitude. And I kind of pull that out now, and hopefully you'll pick some of those things out as we progress. He's an example of faith and patience that we can look to and be exhorted by. And you notice he kind of starts with small challenges, and they get bigger and change in sort of amplitude and sort of depth. Okay, and we'll see that as we develop. I don't talk too long. So chapter 1. So Israel have been taken into captivity, and we have a clear start. And there's a little bit of me. It's in verse 4. So probably several of us in this room, and probably even in the land of Zoom, we wouldn't have got a look in because you had to be good looking to be selected, as it were. He was handsome. They said likely potentially around 16 to 18. Not disabled, had an aptitude for learning languages. And if you think about that aptitude, that he would have become skillful, adept. The key word is fluent at the end of his time. But it clearly demonstrated or illustrated some aptitude in terms of quick understanding. And that was prized in Babylon. And in terms of Babylon, the Chaldeans and likes, it was knowledge was something that they prized. And also come from nobility. So might we have thought that Daniel was a bit of a snob? I don't know. I'll let you have a think about that. But we talked a little while ago, didn't we, about sort of Moses and his time in Pharaoh's court, and he may have been seen to be a bit of a snob. So you see this sort of 3 years of learning, so he would be able to enter the king's service. So an apprenticeship. I'd scribbled a university degree, but I think it's probably somewhere in between. The subtleties in terms of sort of court behavior and nobility. If we were suddenly asked to enter the court of King Charles and suddenly to be a footman, I think it would probably be devastating. I'd lose out, a fish knife or a fork or whatever else, and it would be that, and then some. So his name was changed to Belteshazzar. And so we have quite a start during this sort of period of 3 years. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And we're aware of that. So no to the Babylonian meat and wine, as we see in verse 12, choosing vegetables and water. So now I think I'd have gone for the meat and wine and the likes. Good judgment rather than confrontation or open rebellion. He declined. He refused placing a boundary around himself and the edict of eating royal food, a likely privilege. He put God first. And still young man. And that's the footprint, the impression in terms of his character. Does it change? Does it waver? Well, we know, but it's a young man in a really, suddenly in one sense, put in a very difficult sort of position. Verse 9, God caused him to be favored. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodness of the chief of the eunuchs. Similarities with Joseph, in a sense. And yet, and it's those little bits, sometimes you're reading round and sometimes it's really quite interesting, the daily reading commentaries. Sometimes they give you some nice little nuggets in terms of ideas. But you notice in verse 11, and it's the kind of thing perhaps I hadn't noticed because I'm so silly. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. So actually, so he's there with this steward. He was actually in some form potentially of confinement. So it wasn't necessarily a nice sort of easy time. Under some form of confinement or guard. 10 days of water and vegetables versus royal food and wine. I know which I would have preferred. It's more than it being just about sort of vegetarianism, though, versus meat. I think it's more than that. It gives a perspective in terms of what matters and what doesn't. And I think sometimes in our lives we struggle with deciding what matters, i.e. what is associated with eternal salvation and what doesn't matter. And it's clear so often in Scripture, what matters most is our heart, which provides the motivation for and the reasoning behind all that we do. His heart was bound to God, even now. It was likely food served to idols. There was likely it was more than just meat and wine that's about. Verse 16, the guard, who I feel now exerts a degree of control over him, instigates this vegetable approach. Verse 16. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So ensured that they stuck to that task. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. The thought that springs to mind, sometimes you listen to Poetry Please and other great, it's a really interesting program on Radio 4 talking about poetry, and they'll also do work on, I don't know, Dostoevsky or whoever, and they're great knowledgeable sort of tomes, which I probably read for about a minute and think, no, I'd sooner read science fiction fantasy because I'm that sad of a person. And yet we have it here that God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. So they would have known about the writings that were current, the writings of history, the literature that informed the court, Babylonian society, etc. So they all received understanding of literature. Daniel excelled in wisdom in this land famous for its wise men, and rose to be among three of the highest officers in the Medo-Persian Empire. We see them in chapter 5, verse 29, and chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. But hold back a little. Done with that. Daniel also wrote the book. But you see, there seems to be also a slight contrast. He could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And we see quite clearly that they were clearly better than the rest. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. So they're there before the king. And it wasn't that the king's right-hand man interviewed them. The king interviewed them. So you might, let alone having all that knowledge to hand, you're being interviewed by the king, which would be somewhat daunting. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. None was like them. They were up there. Not just the 11 plus, they got a degree, and the rest, they were up there. And in all matters of wisdom, verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding of which the king examined them, he found them twice as good, 5 times as good, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in the realm. So there'd be, Fred had been an astrologer for 20 years. Can you imagine it? I'd been miffed. Who are these? Who are better than me? They were 10 times better. Okay. So, chapter 2. So they've served this university, and there's this bit whereby Daniel explains the king's dream, and it wasn't the reading that I chose, you'll note. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. So asked all the wise men, tell me what the dream was. No, couldn't do it. Chapter 2 and verse 49. I'm going to be giving. Also, Daniel petitioned the king, and he sent Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Lot compromised. Daniel was resolute. I'll come back to that. Forgive me, I've gone slightly ajar in time. So, chatted to all these wise men. Tell us a dream, and then give us the interpretation. They couldn't do that at all. And there's a bit of me that says, like, where was Daniel in all of this? Because obviously it looks like all these wise men were the Chaldeans, spoke to the king in Aramaic, king live forever, tell your servants to dream, and we will give you the interpretation. Verse 4. Verse 7, let the king tell his servants to dream, and we will give its interpretation. As a kind of logic to their sort of reasoning. Okay. Can't do it, you're going to die. That was the ultimate sort of outcome. Then with counsel and wisdom, wait a minute. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. And for me, there's a strange bit where we were just in chapter 1 and verse 20, Daniel and co, 10 times better, and yet they weren't called first. And was Daniel just sort of pushed out? Was he always just on the outside, despite his wisdom, his intelligence, his tact, diplomacy, etc. Okay. Verse 25. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah will make known to the king the interpretation. And I just wonder that bit of the captives of Judah. Okay, so it's 3 years and a bit now, and he's in the court, but he's still got that taint, for want of a better word. And I just wonder if that was something that stuck. So we know what happened. The dream was interpreted. Yeah, he was in a pretty good sort of situation, because actually, on the cusp of death, he and all the wise men were due to be executed because they were unable to reveal the dream and interpret it. Death was a moment away, literally. After the revelation and interpretation, what was the outcome? Verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. I think my NIV said, paid him honor. They might have had to dust Daniel off, as it were, at one point to bring him in. They'd have forgotten who he was. It was the king who'd paid him honor. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province and Babylon, and chief administrator over all the wise men. And also Daniel positioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but that Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Wow, that is a promotion. He didn't forget Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, though, did he? And he didn't want the prizes, as it were. And I found myself asking myself, would my head have been turned? Of course not. To be in charge of all of Babylon, to have all of that power, from a Metro, that's a very poor old car, to a Jag, and then some. From nobody to somebody. From a council house to a mansion. Things changed. Daniel didn't, or did he? Chapter 3. So you know what happens in chapter 3? Daniel's friends saved in fire. And I've always got a thought in my head, where was Daniel? Was he on a diplomatic mission? Was he involved in some politics? It's not mentioned at all. Chapter 4. Daniel interprets a dream of Nebuchadnezzar. This time Nebuchadnezzar tells his wise men the dream. I bet they're thinking, oh, thanks for a change, you've helped us out. But they couldn't interpret it. Verse 7, they couldn't. It's chapter 4, isn't it? Chapter 4 and verse 7. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. He brought every wise man in under the sun. That was it. The brain's trust, as it were. Couldn't do it. Second time, Daniel arises with an answer. Context. Verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, etc. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. Verse 19. 19. No, what's it? Yeah, through to 27. 27. Oh, grief, that was my doggy. 27. Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. Verse 25. He was going to be. The outcome of this prophecy was that he would. They shall drive you from your men. You'll be dwelling with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass and oxen, etc. Verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name, he was astonished, perplexed. How do I tell him? How do I tell the king? Even more so because having told him, nothing happened for 12 months. Nothing happened for 12 months. How traumatic it must have been awaiting the enactment of this prophecy. He spoke truth to power. It must have taken great courage, I think that's an understatement, to utter the dream's interpretation. Don't blame the messenger as a thought that would be resounding in my head. Might have been easy to send a memo or do it another way. And then suddenly it did. To discuss his arrogance is not an easy task. And as I said, it took time to unravel. The dream was fulfilled. It all happened because Nebuchadnezzar did not follow Daniel's advice. Verse 30, the great Babylonian wonders of the world, etc. Verse 31, while the word was still on the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And you had the preceding verse 30. The king spoke, saying, is this not great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling, for my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. While the words were still on his lips, he got it all. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns. But tonight, something's going to happen. Verse 33, the words did happen. That very hour, the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. And then we come to chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of 1,000. What's happened between chapter 4 and chapter 5? 23 years has happened. There is a gap between them, between the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and the end of Belteshazzar's, in which we don't know what he was doing. Have I got that right? Oh, that's all right. Someone said it's 33. I can live with that. But in which we do not know Daniel's activities. Did he just sort of fade from memory, enter political obscurity? Now, who was that Daniel? It was Michael Foot? It was Gordon Brown? Neil Kinnock? Gordon Heseltine? They're there and then they kind of dissipate. You know, perhaps their portfolio has moved or a new bright light has come in. I don't know. Belteshazzar, son of, that's what it's meant to be, Belshazzar, son of, an Aramaic term that could mean grandson or descendant, or even successor. In his drunken, arrogant state, he calls for vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. And whilst sending his guests into captivity, sending his people into captivity, wanted their captors to show who was in control. This arrogant attitude of Belshazzar required a revelation in a sense to put him in his place. Again, we see that whilst Israel was in captivity, God was in control. Verse 10, chapter 5. So we've got the handwriting on the wall, and no one can read it. The king Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. Can't read these words. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man of your kingdom in whom the Spirit of the Holy God, and in the days of your father, light and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father and the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So why have you forgotten him, as it were? Was Belshazzar the same? He simply had no, sorry. So after the death of Joseph, there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. It cannot be that Pharaoh, as well, had not heard of Joseph's work. He simply had no regard for Joseph or Joseph's God. Was Belshazzar the same? In like manner, Belshazzar would have been aware of what Daniel had done, but had no respect for him. It took his grandmother's intervention to summon Daniel. Human nature and pride is such that it's such that we can forget the obvious or dismiss the obvious. Daniel's character and person, as it were, defined in verse 11 of chapter 5. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God, and in the days of your father. Light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. Not everybody had forgotten him, as it were. His character is still there. Verse 16. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. Others might have forgotten him, but God hadn't. Not lost to God. They had all the wise men in there again, as you saw. I don't want to go on too much because I'll be wittering. All the wise men were there, but they couldn't read the words. Daniel, wisdom, insight, and intelligence. His previous status may have gone in the perception of others. Verse 16 and 17. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then the king answered and said then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him its interpretation. There's character. You can tell if the words were pious or if the words were just about me. I'm appearing humble, but really I'm kind of saying I can do it. There is no bravado. There is no pomposity or anything in that. He wouldn't even accept the paper clip, but I'll come back to that if I hurry up. So Belshazzar asked for the writing to be interpreted. However, Daniel uses the opportunity to rebuke the king from verses 17 to 23. And it's a resounding condemnation for Belshazzar for not learning the lessons that his father learnt. 25 to 28. This is the interpretation of each word. Meaning, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided. and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command. They clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, now about 62 years old. He's been that powerful before, hasn't he? So he's been given something that obviously wasn't there at that point. If only Belteshazzar had taken to heart the experience of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, the outcome of his party that fateful night might have been quite different, even rewarding. But Belshazzar refused to learn lessons from those who had gone before. I think there's some exhortation there for us. Family history, individual history, etc. So, chapter 5, Darius the Mede, perhaps another name. It says another name for Gubaru, referred to in Babylonian inscriptions as the governor of Cyrus, put in charge of the newly conquered Babylonian territory or kingdom managed by Darius. Darius the Mede may have been the throne name of Cyrus. We can think about some of those. Chapter 6 and verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, and in that sense we have a date, as it were, as well. We've got the end of Babylonian Empire now and Darius. It pleased, and who's still there? Daniel, 70 years on now. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. So Daniel, favored by the king, 122 administrators and satraps, by his exceptional qualities, his character, demeanor, leadership, and he had to be a good leader, etc. He was one of the top 3. Set to be, as it were, we see in verse 3, and the verse 3, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit rose in him, and the king thought of setting him over the whole realm. So he's now about to receive the mega promotion. What happened? You know what happened? 122 people tried to nobble him. I know there's probably a better way of describing it, but that's essentially it. It's politics. But this is the interesting bit. You find it later. They looked to find a way to nobble him. And forgive me, I'm certain there's a nicer way of saying it, but they tried to nobble him. 122 people. Can you imagine the underlings underneath as well? They're looking to see, did he fail to send that memo? What did he say that was right? Did he turn up late on Fridays, etc.? If they found one thing, they would have. You look at it, the Labour have just come in and they're going on about the last budget, and they're just finding little ways of saying, 122 powerful people were trying to undermine him. They could not find anything. And I think they disliked him. I think that's an understatement. Because it comes right back to, he was from that lot in Judah who came in right at the beginning. Still that bit, I think that taint that was with him. They were looking to find something that they could entrap him. And they did find something allied to his character. They set a trap wrapped in his faith. They made a law to entrap him. Boy, they hated him. They really came up with one. Oh, hurry up, Gary. Okay. So 122 of them agreed to the trap. Notice, Daniel wasn't aware of it, so he wasn't included, as it were. They worked it out that they got this statement made up. The king signed it, so that the king had signed it, he was now nobbled as well because he'd signed this decree. He couldn't go back on it. And in verse 7, Then I bet you they thought, we have all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, satraps, etc. They consulted together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So one, Daniel is getting on now, because I quite like him, because he's getting on, but he's still relevant. I'm thinking about that in terms of one's faith can burn really brightly when you're 16 and 17. Perhaps if you're 60, 70, it might ease off a little bit. No. And there's exhortation there for us, no matter wherever you are in that numerical sort of scale. I bet you all the governors, etc., 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 having made this degree, that whoever petitions it, they thought, we've got him. There is no way out of this. No loophole. The king has signed the decree. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. Verse 10. Well, Daniel's ready. He knows what's happening. I think he might have gone home and thought, well, that's it. You know what a lot of politicians and the likes do? They end it quite suddenly. He went home and he prayed like he always did. No fear. 3 times a day with the window open, so everybody could see him. We're thinking, oh, grief. Let alone somebody's indicated the window and I don't like drafts. But he did. Verse 14. And I think that's telling. And the king, when he heard these things, was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Bet he was saying something like, come on, Daniel, look, just pretend it's okay. I'll let you off. All you've got to do, you can pretend to pray. You don't have to. You think of any other. No. So he went home, etc. Yeah. Note verse 13. Despite years of service, 50 years even now, he's still one of the exiles from Judah. It says in verse 13. It's still that sort of taint that is with him. It's because I've lost my chapter. It's okay. He had been consistently faithful throughout his sojourn under Babylon, and now under the Medes. His character is consistent. There's no illusion that it could have been. He's now tested again. Captive as a young man, and now at about 70 or 80 years of age, when things are getting difficult, he's now in the lion's den, as it were. Daniel faithfully prayed towards Jerusalem in keeping with Solomon's request concerning Jerusalem and the temple, 1 Kings chapter 8. Praying 3 times a day was not a law, but a reasonable practice. It seems David did the same thing. Verse 22, and I'm kind of rushing through, but you know what transpires. Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. The king was very happy. Verse 24, the king gave the command, and they brought those men who'd accused Daniel and cast them into the den of lions, them and their children and their wives, and the lions overpowered them, and they broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. It's potentially 122 people and their families, potentially. Chapter 7, Daniel's vision. Didn't understand it initially. Later it was interpreted. Verse 28. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. In the last few books of Daniel, there are prophecies that have puzzled many many great minds in terms of understanding. Along with those great minds are the many thousands of the rest of us who read and are not understood. Daniel didn't understand his visions either. They perplexed him. They challenged him physically, but his lack of understanding wasn't going to stop him. Daniel tells us what we should do. Daniel chapter 7 verses 15 and 16. Daniel was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. Daniel's response to the visions he didn't understand was to ask for help in his understanding. Sure enough, the rest of the chapter is devoted to an explanation of the mysterious dream he'd been given. We read of many dreams in Scripture, dreams had by faithful men and Gentile kings. However, it's rare to read that the dream was written down by the one who was given the dream by God. And we see that in this character. Chapter 8, verse 1, about should it be 550 or 551 BC. Daniel's vision in human terms, verse 15, understanding was not an immediate outcome in this. I sought to understand it. A hunger to learn is one of his outstanding character traits. He didn't just say, this is too difficult. It's too difficult to understand. I don't mind. He sought to understand. Where are we? We have some other verses, and we note, I'll probably come back in discussion, but we also note that Daniel was a Bible student. He looked to the word as well for understanding. He meditated on it. Daniel chapter 9. We're in the beginning of the reign of Darius. We're in the first year of his reign. We notice in verse 2, although Yahweh had direct communication with Daniel via Gabriel, Daniel still consulted the scriptures, a Bible student, as it were. What's good for Daniel is clearly essential for us. And it kind of answers the view that, well, one can bypass reading the scriptures. We don't need to. Daniel did. I think I asked Dad to do this reading, and I know it's desperately short, but the prayer that Daniel uttered for his people speaks of his character. Right. 2 minutes. It is a humble prayer, speaking of love. Okay. We have sinned and committed iniquity. We have done wickedly and rebelled, even by departing from your precepts and your judgments. Neither have we heeded your servants, the prophets. You spoke in your name for your king's sake. It's very much a prayer that is inclusive, involves him. He could have uttered the prayer in a completely different way. Actually, your people have done this, but not me. That could have been how he recited that prayer. I think I gave you the wrong reading, as it were. But we have turned away from the law, verse 5. We have not listened, verse 6. He included himself. He could have been aloof. He wasn't. He identified himself with the people. Chapter 10 and verse 1. In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, we've always got those date stamp points that you can hold on to and look at in terms of history, and also plotting where Daniel was. In the 30th of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and understanding the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. It's not actually easy being a prophet. The visions that he saw troubled him. 3 weeks of mourning. Physical and mental strain involved in being a prophet and receiving revelation from God was severe. But God chose those who could cope with this. Again, a lesson for us. David was a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. Daniel was greatly esteemed, potentially 80 or 90 years of age now. Daniel was greatly beloved. Abraham described as a friend of God. Surely we would be happy if any of those descriptions was accurately applied to us. Scripture teaches us that it was about these men that endeared them to the Creator. David's focus was on God's plan to have a meeting place in Jerusalem. Daniel's focus was on the restoration of Jerusalem. Abraham believed that God would very specifically give him a son who would live forever. Jesus said to his disciples that they were his friends if they kept his word. Daniel, a character who spoke of things some he didn't understand, some perplexed him, many unique to him. Faithfulness is a key thing that stands out in reference to this character. That from the start of the captivity and beyond, his faith was a constant. There was nothing, and I'm about to end, and I'm sorry I've really gone on. There is nothing like young Mr. Biden when one looks at Daniel. He's not lost it mentally. There's no cognitive challenges. I don't see him shuffling. I don't see sharp as. None of those kings would have had a doddering so-and-so there. And yet he wasn't proud. He wasn't obnoxious. He wasn't. Salvation is not determined by an understanding of prophecies about the future. Rather, it's based upon an acceptance of the sacrifice of Jesus. Daniel's life is about constant service. There's a twofold reference to his heart. At the beginning, he remained faithful to God. Chapter 1 and verse 8. Chapter 10 and verse 12. His heart was set on God first to the last. And in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 33, he's also referred to then. And I am so sorry I have gone on. I'm stopping there.